morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as tourists gathered behind the metal barriers, cameras ready for the iconic changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a 22-year-old with torn jeans, a faded leather jacket, and hair that hadn't seen a proper cut in months. His presence seemed oddly out of place among the families and elderly tourists who had come to witness the traditional spectacle. Marcus had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of East London, where respect was earned through acts of defiance and rebellion, was worn like a badge of honor. He had spent the previous night sleeping rough under a bridge near Westminster, his stomach empty and his pockets containing nothing but loose change and a crumpled bus ticket. The decision to come to the palace hadn't been planned. He had simply wandered through the streets of central London, drawn by some invisible force toward the seat of British monarchy. As he pressed closer to the barriers, other tourists instinctively moved away from him. His unwashed appearance and the smell of the streets that clung to his clothes created an invisible bubble around him. Marcus was used to this reaction. Society had long ago written him off as just another street punk, another casualty of a system that seemed designed to leave people like him behind. The royal guards began their ceremonial march into the courtyard, their red tunics immaculate and their movements precise. Each guard carried a rifle, though these weapons were largely ceremonial during the tourist-heavy daylight hours. The crowd fell into an appreciative hush as the pageantry unfolded before them. Marcus watched with growing fascination, but also with a building resentment. Here were these men, dressed in their fancy uniforms, protected by centuries of tradition and the full weight of the establishment. They represented everything he felt had been denied to him: stability, respect, purpose. As one guard marched particularly close to the barrier where Marcus stood, something snapped inside the young man's mind. Without warning or hesitation, Marcus lunged forward. His hand shot out between the metal bars of the barrier, grasping for the rifle that hung from the guard's shoulder. The crowd around him gasped as they realized what was happening. In that split second, time seemed to freeze. The guard, trained for ceremonial duties but not expecting such a brazen attempt, felt the tug on his weapon and began to turn. Security cameras captured every angle of the incident. Tourist phones recorded the moment from multiple perspectives. The guard's face showed a mixture of surprise and professional training kicking in. Marcus's expression revealed desperation, mixed with a wild determination that spoke of someone who had nothing left to lose. The barrier between Marcus and the guard suddenly seemed insignificant. The distance between the street punk and the symbol of royal authority had been bridged by one impulsive act that would change both their lives forever. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and retold for years to come. What happened in the next few moments would challenge everything both men thought they knew about duty, desperation, and the thin line that separates order from chaos. The stage was set for an encounter that would reveal the humanity hidden beneath both the uniform and the rebellious exterior, forever altering how each man saw the world and his place within it. The royal guard's name was William Fletcher, and he had served His Majesty's forces for 8 years. At 29, he had completed 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for the prestigious ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. The transition from active combat to tourist-facing pageantry had been jarring, but Fletcher had adapted with the same discipline that had kept him alive in war zones. As Marcus's hand made contact with his rifle, Fletcher's military training kicked in instantly. However, something unexpected happened. Instead of immediately calling for backup or attempting to forcibly remove the intruder's grip, Fletcher found himself looking directly into Marcus's eyes. What he saw there wasn't the calculated menace of a terrorist or the glazed look of someone under the influence of drugs. Instead, he saw something achingly familiar, the same desperate hopelessness he had witnessed in the eyes of young Afghan soldiers who had lost everything. The crowd around them began to murmur and shift nervously. Parents pulled their children closer, while other tourists fumbled with their phones, unsure whether to call for help or continue recording. The other guards in the ceremony had not yet noticed the situation. Their attention focused on maintaining the precise choreography of their movements. Marcus's grip on the rifle tightened, but he made no attempt to actually take the weapon. His action seemed less like a genuine theft attempt and more like a desperate cry for attention, a way to force the world to acknowledge his existence. Fletcher could feel the trembling in the young man's hand through the rifle strap, and he realized that Marcus was probably more terrified than anyone else in the courtyard. For several long seconds, the two men remained locked in this strange tableau. Fletcher had been trained for various security scenarios, but none of his instruction had prepared him for this moment of human connection across such different circumstances. He could have easily broken Marcus's grip, could have called for immediate assistance, could have followed protocol to the letter. Instead, he found himself thinking about his younger brother, who had struggled with addiction and homelessness before eventually getting his life back on track. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of traffic and the nervous whispers of the crowd. Marcus seemed as surprised as anyone by his own actions. His original plan, if it could even be called a plan, had been purely impulsive. Now that he had the guard's attention, he wasn't sure what to do with it. Fletcher made a decision that would later be debated in military circles and analyzed by security experts. Instead of immediately escalating the situation, he chose to de-escalate it through the most human means possible. He looked at Marcus with neither anger nor fear, but with something approaching understanding. The young punk's eyes widened slightly at this unexpected response. He had been prepared for shouting, for violence, for immediate retribution. He had not been prepared for the steady, almost compassionate gaze of someone who seemed to see him as a person rather than just a threat to be neutralized. This moment of recognition between two men, from vastly different worlds, created a bubble of stillness in the chaotic energy of the courtyard. Neither moved to break the contact, each sensing that something important was happening, something that transcended their respective roles as guard and intruder, protector and potential threat. The silence that had fallen over the immediate area was becoming noticeable to others in the ceremony. A fellow guard, Corporal James Morrison, caught sight of the unusual interaction from the corner of his eye. His first instinct was to move quickly to assist Fletcher, but something in his colleague's posture made him pause. Fletcher wasn't displaying any of the body language that would indicate immediate danger or the need for backup. Marcus could feel his heart pounding so hard, he was certain everyone around him could hear it. His hand remained on the rifle, but the initial surge of adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of the magnitude of what he had done. He began to understand that there would be consequences for this action, serious ones that his impulsive decision hadn't allowed him to consider. Fletcher, meanwhile, was conducting his own rapid assessment of the situation. The young man's grip, while firm, wasn't aggressive. His stance suggested someone who was lost rather than dangerous. Most importantly, Fletcher recognized something in Marcus's demeanor that reminded him of soldiers he had known who were struggling with their own demons, men who acted out not from malice but from a deep sense of displacement and desperation. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some tourists had begun to back away, sensing trouble, while others moved closer, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. A few had their phones out, recording what they assumed would be a violent confrontation. One elderly woman near the front of the crowd looked particularly concerned, not for her own safety, but for the young man who so clearly seemed to be in distress. Fletcher made another decision that would later be scrutinized by his superiors. Instead of immediately demanding that Marcus release his weapon, he spoke quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the courtyard. "What's your name, son?" The question caught Marcus completely off guard. In his 22 years, very few people in positions of authority had ever asked him that question, with what sounded like genuine interest. Police officers had demanded his name before arresting him. Social workers had asked it while processing paperwork, but no one had asked it the way Fletcher just had, as if the answer actually mattered. Marcus's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out initially. The simple human question had somehow punctured through all the anger and desperation that had driven him to this moment. When he finally found his voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Marcus." Fletcher nodded slightly as if the name carried weight and importance. "Marcus, I'm William. I think we need to talk, but not here. Not like this." The use of first names created an immediate shift in the dynamic between them. It transformed the interaction from guard versus intruder to something more personal, more human. Marcus found himself looking at Fletcher not as a symbol of authority or privilege, but as an individual who seemed genuinely interested in understanding what had driven him to this desperate act other guards in the ceremony were beginning. to notice that something was amiss with Fletcher's position, but their training kept them from breaking formation without a clear signal of distress. The ceremonial nature of their duties meant that minor disruptions were often handled with minimal fuss to avoid spoiling the tourist experience. The crowd sensed the change in atmosphere as well. The initial tension was giving way to curiosity, and even sympathy as they watched the two men engage in what appeared to be a genuine conversation rather than a confrontation. Fletcher's mind was working quickly, calculating the best way to resolve the situation without causing harm to Marcus or creating a public incident that would reflect poorly on the regiment. He had seen enough genuine combat to recognize the difference between a real threat and someone who was simply drowning in their own circumstances. "Marcus," Fletcher continued, his voice still low and steady, "I'm going to ask you to let go of my rifle now. Not because I'm ordering you to, but because I think you're better than this moment, and I'd like the chance to prove that I'm right." The words hit Marcus with unexpected force. No one had ever expressed belief in him before, especially not a stranger and certainly not someone in uniform. Throughout his life, authority figures had written him off, dismissed him, or simply tried to control him. The idea that this guard might actually see potential in him was both thrilling and terrifying. Marcus's grip on the rifle loosened slightly, though he didn't immediately let go. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice carrying years of hurt and disappointment. "You don't know what it's like." Fletcher nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, I don't know your specific story, but I know what it feels like to be angry at the world, to feel like you've been forgotten or left behind. I know what it's like to do something desperate because you can't see any other way to make people notice that you exist." The honesty in Fletcher's response surprised Marcus. He had expected lectures, threats, or dismissive comments. Instead, he was hearing something that sounded like understanding, possibly even empathy. It was so unexpected that it began to defuse the anger that had been driving him. Around them, the crowd was beginning to realize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't turning into the violent confrontation that many had feared. Instead, it was becoming a genuine human interaction, a moment of connection between two people from completely different worlds. An older tourist, a retired teacher named Margaret Collins, found herself moved by what she was observing. She had spent 40 years working with troubled young people, and she recognized the signs of someone who had been failed by the system rather than someone who was inherently dangerous. She began to quietly encourage other tourists to give the two men space rather than crowding closer with their cameras. Fletcher could see that Marcus was wavering, caught between his initial impulse and the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. The guard realized that this moment could go either way. Marcus could either release his grip and allow the situation to be resolved peacefully, or he could panic and escalate things in a way that would force Fletcher to respond with the full weight of his training. "I tell you what, Marcus," Fletcher said, making another calculated risk. "If you let go of my rifle right now, I'll make you a promise. When my shift ends in 2 hours, I'll meet you at the cafe across the street and we'll talk properly. No uniforms, no ceremony, just two people having a conversation." Marcus stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do that? Why would you want to talk to someone like me?" Fletcher smiled slightly, the first time his expression had changed since the encounter began. "Because I think everyone deserves to have their story heard by someone who's willing to listen. And because I have a feeling that if someone had listened to you before today, we might not be standing here like this." The simple truth of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. It was exactly what he had been seeking without even realizing it. Someone who would see him as more than just a problem to be solved or a threat to be neutralized. Someone who would acknowledge his humanity and treat him with dignity. The weight of Fletcher's promise hung in the air between them. Marcus had spent so many years being disappointed by adults who made commitments they never intended to keep that he had learned to expect betrayal. Yet something in the guard's manner suggested sincerity, a quality Marcus had rarely encountered in his interactions with authority figures. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus loosened his fingers and released his grip on the rifle. The action felt symbolic, as if he were letting go of more than just the weapon. As his hand fell back to his side, he felt a mixture of relief and vulnerability that left him slightly dizzy. Fletcher maintained eye contact with Marcus throughout the release, offering a small nod of acknowledgement and respect. "Thank you," he said simply, and Marcus could tell that the gratitude was genuine. The crowd around them seemed to exhale collectively as the tension dissipated. Many of the tourists began to realize that they had witnessed something remarkable, a potentially dangerous situation that had been resolved through compassion and human connection rather than force or authority. Corporal Morrison, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing admiration for his colleagues' handling of the situation, quietly signaled to the other guards that everything was under control. The ceremony could continue with minimal disruption, though the story of what had just happened would spread quickly through both the military ranks and the tourist community. Fletcher resumed his position in the formation, but not before giving Marcus a final meaningful look. 2 hours, he said quietly. The cafe with the red awning across the street. I'll be there. Marcus stepped back from the barrier, his legs feeling unsteady. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving him feeling exposed and uncertain. Several tourists looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern, but no one approached him directly. Margaret Collins, the retired teacher who had been observing the exchange, made a decision of her own. As Marcus began to walk away from the crowd, she quietly followed him. When they were away from the immediate area, she gently touched his arm. "Excuse me, dear," she said in a voice that was warm, but not condescending. "I couldn't help but notice what just happened back there. Are you all right?" Marcus turned to look at her, surprised by the genuine concern in her eyes. "I'm fine," he said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. Margaret studied his face for a moment. "You know, I've been a teacher for most of my life, and I've learned to recognize when someone is carrying more weight than they should have to bear alone. That guard, William, seemed like a decent man. I hope you'll keep that appointment with him." Marcus found himself nodding, though he wasn't entirely sure why. There was something about this elderly woman's manner that reminded him of his grandmother, the only adult who had ever shown him unconditional kindness before her death when he was 14. "I don't have anywhere else to be," Marcus admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. Margaret smiled gently. "Well then, perhaps this is exactly where you're supposed to be today. Sometimes the universe has a way of putting the right people in front of us at exactly the moment we need them most." As she walked away to rejoin her tour group, Marcus found himself alone with 2 hours to kill and a promise to keep. For the first time in months, he had something to look forward to, something that might lead to a conversation that could change the trajectory of his life. Marcus spent the next 2 hours wandering the streets around Buckingham Palace, his mind replaying the encounter over and over again. He had expected immediate arrest, public humiliation, or at the very least a forceful rejection of his desperate bid for attention. Instead, he had received something he had never experienced before: genuine human compassion from someone who had every reason to see him as a threat. As the appointed time approached, Marcus found himself standing across from the cafe Fletcher had mentioned, studying the red awning and wondering if the guard would actually show up. His experience with broken promises had taught him to expect disappointment, but something about Fletcher's manner suggested reliability. At exactly 2 hours after their encounter, Fletcher emerged from the palace gates. He had changed out of his ceremonial uniform into civilian clothes, jeans, a simple sweater, and a jacket that made him look like any other young man in London. The transformation was striking. Without the uniform, Fletcher looked approachable, almost ordinary. Marcus watched from across the street as Fletcher approached the cafe, scanning the area until he spotted the young punk. When their eyes met, Fletcher raised his hand in a small wave and crossed the street with confident steps. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Fletcher said as he reached Marcus. "I wasn't sure you would either," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Fletcher gestured toward the cafe. "Shall we get some coffee? I don't know about you, but I could use something warm." Inside the cafe, they found a quiet corner table away from other customers. Fletcher ordered 2 coffees and a sandwich, which he pushed toward Marcus without comment. The simple gesture of providing food without being asked spoke volumes about Fletcher's character and his understanding of Marcus's circumstances. For several minutes, they sat in silence, each taking the measure of the other in this new, more relaxed setting. Finally, Fletcher spoke first. "I want you to know that what happened today isn't going to result in any charges or official action. I've spoken with my superiors, and we've agreed to treat it as a minor incident that was resolved through proper de-escalation techniques." Marcus looked up from his coffee, surprise evident on his face. "Really, no arrest, no record?" Fletcher shook his head. No, nothing like that. But I am curious about what drove you to do it. You didn't seem like someone who was actually trying to steal a weapon or cause harm. It felt more like someone who was trying to be seen. The perceptiveness of Fletcher's observation caught Marcus off guard. He had spent so much of his life being misunderstood or dismissed that having someone read his motivations so accurately was both unsettling and liberating. You're right, Marcus said slowly. I don't really know why I did it. I was angry, I guess. Tired of feeling invisible. Tired of feeling like nothing I do matters to anyone. Fletcher nodded encouragingly. Tell me about that. Tell me about your life if you're willing to share it. Over the next hour, Marcus found himself opening up in ways he had never done before. He told Fletcher about growing up in foster care after his mother's death, about aging out of the system at 18 with no support network or life skills. He described the cycle of temporary jobs and temporary housing, the constant struggle to find stability in a world that seemed designed to keep people like him on the margins. Fletcher listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions and offering no quick solutions or empty platitudes. His own military background had given him experience with people who had been broken by circumstances beyond their control, and he recognized that Marcus needed understanding more than advice. As Marcus talked, something remarkable began to happen. The anger and desperation that had driven him to the palace that morning began to transform into something else. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility that his life could be different than it had been. As their conversation continued, Fletcher began to share his own story. He spoke about his difficult transition from active military service to ceremonial duties, about the challenge of finding purpose in peacetime after the intensity of combat. He talked about his younger brother's struggles with addiction and homelessness, and how that experience had given him insight into the challenges faced by people like Marcus. The thing is, Fletcher said, leaning forward slightly, I've learned that most people who act out aren't really looking for trouble. They're looking for connection, for someone to acknowledge that they matter. What you did today was dangerous and could have ended badly, but I understood what you were really asking for. Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat. Never in his adult life had anyone spoken to him with such insight and compassion. The conversation was revealing possibilities he had never considered, that his actions could be understood rather than simply condemned, that his struggles could be seen as challenges to overcome rather than character flaws. Fletcher reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. I want to give you something, he said, placing the card on the table between them. This is the contact information for a veteran support organization that also works with civilians who are struggling with similar issues. They helped my brother get back on his feet, and I think they might be able to help you too. Marcus picked up the card and studied it carefully. The organization was called Second Chances, and their mission statement spoke about providing practical support and mentorship for people working to rebuild their lives. They're good people, Fletcher continued. They understand that sometimes life knocks you down through no fault of your own, and they're committed to helping people find their way back up. If you call them and mention my name, they'll make sure you get connected with someone who can help. The offer was more than Marcus had dared to hope for. Not only was Fletcher refusing to treat him as a criminal, but he was actively working to connect him with resources that could make a real difference in his life. Why are you doing this? Marcus asked, his voice thick with emotion. Why do you care what happens to me? Fletcher considered the question carefully before answering. Because everyone deserves a chance to have a life that matters. Because I believe that people are capable of change when they're given the right support. And because I think you have more potential than you realize. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Fletcher made one final offer. I want you to have my personal phone number, he said, writing it on a napkin. Not for emergencies or anything official, but just in case you need someone to talk to who understands what it's like to feel lost. Everyone needs at least one person in their corner, and I'd like to be that person for you if you'll let me. Marcus took the napkin with hands that shook slightly. In the space of a few hours, he had gone from feeling completely alone in the world to having not just one but multiple sources of potential support. The transformation felt almost too good to be true. 6 months later, Marcus would be living in transitional housing provided by Second Chances, working as an apprentice electrician, and meeting with Fletcher for coffee once a week. The desperate young man who had grabbed for a Royal Guards rifle would be replaced by someone who had found purpose, stability, and most importantly, a sense of belonging in the world. The incident that could have ended in arrest and prosecution instead became the turning point that allowed Marcus to build the life he had always wanted but never believed was possible. And Fletcher would carry the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the most important battles are won, not through force or authority, but through the simple act of treating another human being with dignity and compassion. Their story would become legend among the palace guards, a reminder that their role extended beyond ceremony and tradition to include the fundamental human responsibility of recognizing and responding to others in need. The silence that had fallen over the courtyard that morning had indeed changed everything, proving that sometimes the most powerful interventions come not from what we say, but from our willingness to truly listen and respond with our hearts.